Hello, I'm Jared Taylor with American Renaissance, and I'd like to talk about the reality of race.
Hello everyone and welcome back. So since the last video I did on this guy didn't really have any science or history to debunk, I thought I'd look back at one of his videos with a bit more solid meat to consume. This video talks about the biology of race, something near and dear to Jared Taylor's black little heart. So let's take a look at the claims he makes here and we'll go from there, shall we? First things first though, in spite of references to many scientific sources in this video, none of them are actually linked in the video itself, so I had to do some digging to find them. Hopefully if I'm off base with any of these sources, you'll let me know.
It's fashionable to claim that race is a social construct, an illusion, with no basis in biology. Craig Venter, who became famous for sequencing the human genome, claims that, quote, "The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis."
Well, Dr. Venter is right and wrong with this one. There is genetic variation between different populations of people across the planet. However, race as it's commonly understood and applied in general discourse is absolutely a social construct, particularly as it's generally represented by, quote, race realists like yourself, Jared, who are obsessed with linking the phenomenon of population genetics with the merits of different races in terms of intelligence, work ethic, moral clarity, and other similar nonsense. While there is value to population genetics, race, as presented by you and others like you, Jared, is simply a pseudoscientific justification for your bigotry. No more, no less.
In 2011, even the Museum of Natural History in Washington had an exhibit that claimed to, quote, question the very concept of race. Well, common sense tells us this is wrong. No one could possibly mistake a Scandinavian for an Australian Aborigine. It took tens of thousands of years for those differences to evolve. The idea that race is some kind of illusion is so obviously wrong and stupid that only very intelligent people could persuade themselves that it's true.
Wow. So yeah, a lot to unpack here. First off, when you're making an argument about science and your first go-to is, quote, common sense, you've already demonstrated how little you care about the evidence. That you're really only basing your argument mainly on vibes and appearance instead of actual science. But let's dig a little into this, shall we? The fact is that we are an incredibly young species. We evolved in Africa only between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, compared with our nearest living relative, the chimpanzee, which evolved between 5 and 7 million years ago. We are babies on the evolutionary timeline, in relative terms. We're also an incredibly homogeneous species. Out of the 3.2 billion base pairs in our DNA, only about 20 million of them will vary between any two individuals. In other words, the genetic difference between any two people, regardless of race, is only about 0.6%. There's an added layer of irony to this genetic reality in that we find the greatest genetic variation between individuals from different groups within Africa, far greater than we do between people from different groups on other sides of the planet. In other words, a Maasai and a Fulani person are going to likely have a far greater genetic distinction between them than a Brit and a Korean individual would. And that's the sad thing about Jared's appeal. He'll take a little grain of truth or half-truths and spin it into justification for so much pseudoscientific knowledge. But it will sound articulate and reasonable enough to pass muster, at least at first glance.
No one could possibly mistake a Scandinavian for an Australian Aborigine. It took tens of thousands of years for those differences to evolve.
The thing is that these two would share about 99.4% of their genome with each other. Most evidence, both genetic and anthropological, suggests that both populations left Africa between 60 and 70,000 years ago. It seems like Jared here has taken the most superficial view possible, seeing the relative skin tone difference between these two women and decided that's obvious enough to show that race as he understands it exists. not even noticing the fact that he's just reaffirming the fact that race is predominantly a social construct, and that the variation one can see between these two groups is mainly due to living in this environment versus this environment. Does it make it easy to see the difference between these two? Sure, but in terms of their biology, the difference is minuscule. It's what happens when a small, isolated population gets 2,500 generations of environmental adaptation. And from this, Jared here wants to claim that the difference in appearance validates the science of race, while demonstrating the fact that his entire argument is based on looks and, quote, common sense. It makes your final comment here particularly ironic.
The idea that race is some kind of illusion is so obviously wrong and stupid that only very intelligent people could persuade themselves that it's true.
No, Jared, you don't have to be especially intelligent. You just have to be less superficial and a little more willing to educate yourself on how small the genetic and phenotypic variations are in terms of human diversity.
So, where does this idea even come from? It's based on the fact that there is more genetic variation within races than between them. 85% of human genetic variation is found within any given race, and racial differences account for only 15% of genetic variation. But that does not mean that race is an illusion. That 15% difference between races is important.
Oof. He actually referred to something honestly, and then went on to claim that it doesn't really matter. But let's look a little bit into this claim on variation between races. The claim comes from a 1972 paper by geneticist Richard Lewontin called The Apportionment of Human Diversity. Obviously, being written in 1972, he didn't have the entire human genome to work with, and instead relied on 17 specific genetic markers in his research. In spite of this, his assertion that the genetics behind racial classifications is biologically negligible has been consistently reaffirmed in modern research. That 85-15 ratio still holds relatively consistently, but it's an 85-15 ratio on that 0.6% of the human genome. In other words, when Jared says that 15% is very important, it sounds better than saying that 0.09% is very important. That 1/1000th of the human genome is what really matters in categorizing people, making sure that they don't intermingle, that whites keep that 1/1000th of a percent of their genome pure and uncontaminated by other races. Yeah, it sounds more disgusting when it's out in honest terms. When the mask is off, it's no different than the eugenics of the early 20th century, because that's exactly what it is. Jared has always and will always peddle this bullshit as truth, regardless of what the science actually says. So now let's see Jared point to more examples that sound nice as long as you don't actually think about it beyond a very surface level.
Consider the differences between the sexes. What you see on the screen are the 46 chromosomes that make up the human genome. Do you see that stumpy little chromosome in the lower right-hand corner? That's the Y chromosome. Men have it and women don't, but otherwise they're genetically identical. That's a very small genetic difference. But look at the physical differences between the sexes. Some are absolute. Women have organs men don't, and vice versa. And other differences are like the differences between races. Height, for example, is controlled almost entirely by genes, and we know that men on average are taller than women. However, the range of heights for men, from the shortest man to the tallest man, is much greater than the difference in height between the average man and the average woman. So there is greater variation within the sexes than between them. But that doesn't make the sex difference in average height go away, does it?
Yeah, speaking of surface level, he goes right into the differences between sexes and then demonstrates how little he understands about sexual dimorphism in humans. Here's a fun fact. We're all female in the womb until the Y chromosome cascade happens at 6 weeks, give or take a few days. That cascade differentiates the gonads, ovaries for women, testes for men. From there, biologically, he seems to just ignore the fact that we're pretty sexually monomorphic until puberty, when all these differences between the two sexes start to spring up. The thing is that variation is about hormones, not genetics. That stubby little gene does nothing more than set off the TDF that leads to further selective hormone production, meaning that, as usual, Jared has taken this tiny grain of truth and built a mountain of bullshit around it. Keep that in mind as he starts talking about race here.
Anyone who claims race is an illusion would logically have to say that dog breeds are illusions. 27% of the total genetic variation in dogs is between breeds. That is more than the 15%, which is the variation between human races. But it is still correct to say that there is a lot more genetic variation within dog breeds than between them. But look at the tremendous differences that result from that 27%. Dogs can be strikingly different in appearance, temperament, lifespan, and susceptibility to disease. These differences are simply an expanded version of human racial differences, 27% versus 15%.
Again, Jared's rhetoric can sound nice, even compelling, as long as you don't look too hard. Simply a slightly expanded version of what we see in humans. By slightly expanded, you mean nearly double. But sure, for the sake of argument, let's say jumping from 15 to 27% is only a slight expansion. First off, dogs are unique in their morphological variation, mainly because of us. Humans have spent millennia specifically and selectively breeding dogs for various tasks. Jobs where size, shape, coat, strength, endurance, and many other factors play a massive role. That's just how artificial selection works, and why it's so effective. Just compare dogs with our other domesticated companions, cats. When the species is left to its own devices overall, in other words, just left to catch rodents and bask in the sun all day, the variation ends up being far less pronounced, unless we specifically breed a set of cats to follow a specific path. Just like the variation was far less pronounced before dogs were domesticated and were instead just wolves. The fact is, all this variation Jared is talking about is a direct result of us. Our intervention and selective breeding gave us this wide morphology. It's not a natural outcome of dogs if they weren't bred into specific roles, meaning that we literally design dogs to fit certain molds, not the other way around. So Jared pointing out this to justify his narrative tells me he's either ignorant of the science, dishonest, or both. My money's on both.
If race is not a biological reality, how can you tell someone's race just from his DNA? A classic 2005 study led by Dr. Neil Risch of UC San Francisco looked at the DNA of 3,636 people who were white, black, East Asian, and Hispanic. His team could distinguish race with 100% accuracy using just a tiny piece of the genome. They could even tell Japanese and Chinese apart. Can you tell them apart?
I am glad Jared brought this up in spite of his misuse of its findings. Yes, the study looked at 3,636 people, and only 5 of the participants differed between their stated race and their genetic indicators, which is a great indicator for the value of population genetics. What's funny, too, is that further research has shown that there are genetic indicators for people who describe themselves as Samburu, Yoruba, or Himba, even though Jared here would just call all of them black. Just like Jared would call all the Spaniards, Celtic, Gaelic, and Nordic folks all white. In spite of them all having genetic indicators for their ancestry as well. Once again, Jared is pointing to a study that has real value in terms of population genetics, looking at the predispositions for certain populations having certain genetic disorders or hereditary traits, and boiling it all down into something that it simply is not, all to justify his pseudoscience to a gullible and willing audience. Neil Risch himself has stated that this is a starting point, not an end point for biological research, because there's a rich value in ancestral heritage to populations of people all over the world, which we just slapped the label of races onto as we began to colonize the planet. Maybe that's why Jared just talked about the study rather than actually linking to it, which is why I linked the study and a few articles discussing its findings in the description of the video.
In 2013, Purnima Kumar of Ohio State University discovered that you can tell someone's race just from looking at the type of bacteria living in his mouth. As Dr. Kumar explained, quote, ethnicity is a huge component in determining what you carry in your mouth.
Again, Jared doesn't cite the source, so I had to go and find the study. Turns out that it had an average accuracy of roughly 62%, and the actual intention of the research was to find better treatment options for patients based upon the microbiome living in their mouth. But Jared here just wants to use it to further his narrative on how irreconcilably different we all are and how important it is to preserve the integrity of our races. Again, it's a kernel of truth surrounded by a mountain of bullshit.
There are race differences in hormone levels, gestation time, rate of development, brain size, eye size, genital size, hair type, bone density, fat distribution, age of puberty onset, lifespan, twinning rates, myopia rates, disease rates, etc., etc. These are biological facts. They're not sociological constructs.
These are all biological, but calling them facts seems a little weird. More importantly, they're not all or exclusively genetic. Environmental factors, social factors, diet, physical exercise, stress factors, significant social and personal events all play a massive role in all of these biological instances. But Jared needs to make it all fit into a racial narrative. He's spent his entire life doing that, so obviously he's going to do it here too. It all just sounds a little more compelling when it's out in the middle of all this fancy science, doesn't it? Even if the science is being misrepresented throughout to fit his narrative. Hell, this video is less than 10 minutes long, and look at how much has to go into refuting this narrative for the bullshit that it is. Speaking of bullshit, let's continue.
As just one example, Dr. Mitch Roslin of Lenox Hill Hospital in New York found in 2013 that if you put white and black women on exactly the same diet and exercise program and monitor them closely, white women lose more weight than black women. It's because black women have slower metabolisms. Dr. Roslin's conclusion, quote, there are racial and genetic differences in obesity. These things are real.
So I looked up this guy. In every single one of his published papers, articles, conferences, I've linked it all in the description, but I can't find this particular claim in any publications in 2013, 2014, 2011, 2010. It's not there. Is Jared making it up? Maybe. I can't say for certain because Jared doesn't cite his sources. So I'll leave this up to the viewer. If you can dig up this mysterious paper, let me know, but I'm done wasting my time on this. Peddling bullshit is so easy when you can just make it up, polish it to sound compelling, and then push it out to the public, and don't actually have to back it up with evidence.
Well, doctors understand this. The FDA has approved a heart failure drug called Bidil, but only for blacks who do not benefit from conventional heart failure drugs. In 2013, scientists at Thomas Jefferson University found that the formation of blood clots follows a different molecular route in blacks compared to whites. This contributes to higher rates of heart disease and lower survival rates for blacks. It's because of medical differences like these that there are even diagnostic tests that are tailored to specific races. In some cases, it would be outright malpractice for a doctor to pretend that race was an illusion.
Yes, Jared. Yes. Thank you, actually, for pointing out the value of population genetics and the specifics of patient care. I'm so glad that you actually brought up Bidil specifically because it's no longer manufactured. Why is that? Why is that? Because it didn't work the way that it claimed to. It wasn't as effective at dealing with the heart problems as it proclaimed before approval, and it turned out that environmental factors played a much larger role than the manufacturers claimed. Not only that, the research was based on self-identification, not on those racial genetic markers that you were just talking about not 5 minutes ago with the Risch study. So not only was the medication not very effective overall, it also failed so spectacularly specifically because it relied on the superficial identifiers of race that you seem so fixated on, Jared, because those identifiers are sociological, not biological. And when the sociological element came headfirst into the biology, the result was this failed medication. Yet again, demonstrating that race as you identify it is superficial and meaningless. Again, a kernel of truth misrepresented and turned into a mountain of bullshit. It's exactly why population genetics is valuable and studied by scientists, while eugenics and race realism is bullshit and embraced by you and your fellow bigots. Not because it's valuable science, but because it's useful rhetoric to spread your hate. So thanks, Jared. You really stuck the landing with that one, didn't you, buddy?
It's been recently discovered that Homo sapiens mated with Neanderthals, maybe 60,000 years ago. Everyone on Earth, except for Africans, has up to 3% Neanderthal genes.
So it's between 1 and 4%, higher in East Asians generally, but it's also found in African populations, just at about 0.3%, so less than other populations, but still present. See how nuance plays such a big role when you move past ideological grandstanding on misrepresenting science and just look at the statistics? Funny, isn't it?
And I haven't even talked about sports. In the last 7 Olympics, not just every winner, but every finalist in the men's 100-meter dash was of West African origin. The long-distance running events are crushingly dominated by East Africans. That's an impressive record for a social construct.
Now, onto marathon racing. Yes, Africans do consistently do well in marathons. Funny how you don't cite any scientific data on this particular claim. So I'll just add a few insights since you don't seem interested. First off, there's the fact that when we started as a species, we were endurance hunters. No species on the planet can outrun us on a long enough timeline. We can run down any prey to exhaustion. Whether it be a buffalo, a mountain lion, a gazelle, it doesn't matter. We can run any other mammal to exhaustion if we give it enough time. It was how we hunted, it was how we survived. So is it any surprise that environments and cultures closest to this root of our history as a species can do so well at this particular physical feat? But again, the genetic factor is minimal compared with other factors like training and culture. If anything, at best, it simply shows what some of us have lost through generations and migration, with the main factor lost being a need to do this kind of running on a regular basis. There's nothing genetic keeping other groups of people from reaching this peak level of physical conditioning. But Jared sees a tall, thin black guy running and immediately attributes it entirely to race, concluding that it just makes sense instead of citing actual data.
So your instinctive understanding is correct. Race is real. As Ernst Mayr of Harvard has pointed out, quote, "Those who subscribe to the opinion that there are no human races are obviously ignorant of human biology."
And now, of course, you have to quote mine a guy like Ernst Mayr. There's really no surprise there. First off, I'm not going to criticize Mayr. The man has a fantastic legacy in the field of evolutionary biology. He was critical in our developing understanding of punctuated equilibrium, and the man had an incredible career. He also tended to use the term race as synonymous with the term subspecies. But to boil him down in this way is such an oversimplification of what he believed. I'll link some sources, but here's a basic oversimplification of what he believed, since that seems to be what we're apparently doing here. He believed that there are races in other species in the animal kingdom, and that humans should not be excluded from that view. that population isolation has created genetic distinctions in part of the world, that some of these distinctions are obvious, like skin color, hair, and eye color, and some are more nuanced, like predispositions for diseases like sickle cell anemia or Tay-Sachs. Most importantly, that these distinctions are not indicators of merit, that some group of or other is qualitatively better due to their distinctions. And finally, that these distinctions are on an incredibly short timeline when compared to other species, that with the ease of global migration, many of these distinctions will fade over time. In other words, Mayer had a very nuanced view on this issue, developed over decades of study of evolutionary biology, and he had no support for the eugenics of so-called race scientists, and has always made his views of people like Jared Taylor very clear. Which makes this a special kind of disgusting to quote mine and bastardize his decades of research, all to support a bullshit narrative that the man himself would have never supported. But then again, Jared's never been above exploiting anything and everything he can to fit his narrative.
So why do people push this silly idea? I think there are two reasons. One is to persuade white people that immigration and mixed marriage mean nothing. It doesn't matter if whites are replaced by non-whites because we're being replaced by ourselves. And if we marry outside our race, it's no different from marrying white people.
Ah, there it is. There it is. It took you long enough, Jared. All that build-up of bad arguments just to get where we all knew that you really wanted to go. Yes, Jared here opposes marrying outside of your race. But all the science on specific population genetics goes out of the window here. You see, Jared doesn't care if a Nord marries a Celt or if a Slav marries an Italian, because to Jared, race only matters if it falls outside of a certain range of pigmentation. Irish and French, have fun, bang away. But black and French, how dare you? It doesn't matter if they're Maasai, Sam, or Himba, they're black, which is all that matters to Jared. Even if these different, quote, blacks are more genetically diverse between each group than any group outside of Africa. Because it was never really about the science. It was about the bigotry. The misrepresentation of science just helps make it more palatable. It's why this all comes at minute 8 of a 9-minute video. It's why people look to a person like Jared to give a pseudo-intellectual veneer to the bullshit. He's articulate, intelligent. He gives the auspices of sophistication to arguments that always boil down to nothing more than a hatred of anything and anyone that's not white enough to pass Jared's arbitrary litmus test. He's made a career out of it for decades, and it's been very successful, in spite of relying on arguments that are nothing more than pure bullshit and bad science. It's why in my last video I said that Jared is the godfather of people like Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk, or the Jordan Peterson of race science. He's been doing what they do a lot longer and with the airs of sophistication and intellect. Let's continue.
The other reason is that many people are afraid that if there are races, and races are different, that there could be race differences in intelligence. Listen to John Horgan, writing in 2013 in Scientific American, no less. Quote, "Part of me wonders whether research on race and intelligence should simply be banned. It seems to me to have no redeeming value. Scientific American is afraid of science."
So of course, he has to wrap this video up on his favorite pet topic, the one nearest and dearest to his heart, trying to tie race to intelligence. He doesn't go into it too deeply in this video, but I'll respond to what he does talk about here because it's just as disgusting as you'd expect.
Listen to John Horgan, writing in 2013 in Scientific American, no less. Quote, "Part of me wonders whether research on race and intelligence should simply be banned. It seems to me to have no redeeming value. Scientific American is afraid of science." Well, I'm not afraid of science.
But I did, of course, have to look a little more into the article Jared mined for that little quote. It has a lot of worthwhile things to say in rebuttal to Taylor and eugenicists in general, but I think the quote he took in that article from Noam Chomsky sums it up quite nicely. Quote, "Those who argue that there is a correlation between race and IQ, and those who deny this claim are contributing to racism and other disorders because what they are saying is based on the assumption that the answer to the question makes a difference. It does not, except to racists, sexists, and the like." Which I think sums up all of Jared's talking points quite nicely. I do not think that there is a significant genetic component to something like intelligence, let alone the far more ineffective and arbitrary metric of IQ testing. But even if there was some genetic element to it, it only matters to bigots like this in furtherance of justifying their hatred of certain colors of people. Not races of people, colors of people. Because with Jared Taylor, there's a reason he has no use for nuanced topics like population genetics or evo-devo, other than as fodder for him to mine to prop up his presupposed worldview. There is a fascinating range of learning that can be found in the exploration of our individual and collective heritage, history, and ancestry. Biological components of it can be valuable in understanding both where we came from and what advantages and disadvantages us and our families may face as a result of our heritage. Everything from the color of our eyes to our potential predispositions for things like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs or hypothyroidism. But when people like Taylor here take this fascinating and nuanced field of study and dumb it down, strip all the nuance out of it, oversimplify it down to white, black, brown, yellow, or red, and then use these bass-ackwards, dishonest misrepresentations of actual phylogeny, all to provide some sort of fucked up merit metric to pin on people based on their skin color, it bastardizes the entire thing and makes it into nothing other than useful rhetorical tools to prop up racists, sexists, and the like. Because it's never been about the science. It's been about the ideology first and foremost, and then trying to find little bits and pieces of the science that they can twist and contort to fit their narrative. At the end of the day, they just want to hold white people on a pedestal and keep anyone outside of that skin tone away from their women and preserving the white race. The white race. No matter how much they try to bury this basic bigotry behind pseudoscience and flowery rhetoric, the fact is that the science doesn't back up their bullshit. Which is why Taylor is relegated to quote mining actual scientists and making a career from speaking to his fellow racists, instead of actually trying to get his bullshit to pass academic muster and peer review. It's way easier to peddle this nonsense on YouTube competently and articulately enough to make the passive viewer nod along and find it compelling than it is to actually do the research and back your bullshit up. In this environment, at this point in history, it's especially important to call out this garbage for exactly what it is, because while Taylor may be relegated to the gutters of obscurity, the message from him and his ilk has spread far and wide, in recent years, all the way to the White House. Yeah, all the way to the fucking White House. So yeah, that's all I have for you today in this video. From here, Jared just tries to push the audience to go and watch another video of his explicitly on specifically race and intelligence, which at some point I might like to get to, but as you can see, even 10 minutes can be a frustrating endeavor to get through, because he never cites his sources and peddles nothing but nonsense, so even a brief video can be quite the challenge to dig through all the details of. That being said, thanks for taking the time to listen. As always, any thoughts and feedback are welcome in the comments below. Other than that, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next one.